things on the CU Boulder campus. It was started in 2009 by Dr. Lori Emerson as mostly as an interest in showing the software poetry of B.P. Nickel on the original Apple IIe hardware. And so she started with a collection of 13 Apple IIes, I believe is the correct number, but very quickly learned that what she was actually interested in was the interface. So some of our collection, I was doing an audio tour of the space yesterday and lost count at 37 computers on display that are actually functional in this front room. So we function as a sort of media lab play space. We try to keep everything functional. We try to keep software for every computer. We try to keep media for every other device. So in addition to personal computing history, we have a large collection of typewriters, like word processor, audio listening devices, varieties, video game consoles, huge variety of different media devices that live in our space, and a big part of my job is keeping them working and introducing people to things that are well outside of their personal timeline. So Ashlyn mentioned that Infocom games are before her time, and they're before mine as well, but because we have this space where we can interact with the contemporary with the software and interact with these devices in a way that sort of revivify them, we have a really unique opportunity in this lab to do that. I'm going to give you a quick pan of what we're talking about. So everything from weird clones of Apple II devices to Timex Sinclairs to either a true rarity, the Osborne Vixen, a pink Commodore 64. Our collection is pretty broad, and we're very interested in all of the differences that can come about because of that. Things that were successful and things that were failures all kind of get mashed together so that you can think about the complications of those devices as they are related to each other. So I'm going to switch camera views really quick because we're going to be playing a quick demo of Leather Goddesses of Phobos on the Apple IIc, which is my favorite device to demo things on because I love it. And we have lots of Infocom. We have lots of Infocom in our collection. It's always a good time. So Joss kindly sent us a pair of additional games, the IBM compatible versions for us, but we already had an Apple II compatible version with most of the feelies inside of it. Mine Forever Voyaging is my very favorite game. So all of the feelies inside of this, or most of the feelies inside of this, the 3D glasses are a later purchase because we needed them to look at the Lane Mastodon comic, which is delightful. We also have maps and Infocom ads. And the original Scratch and Sniff card, which, Joss, your colors are close. The original Scratch and Sniff card no longer has any sniff to it. We've tried. It just smells like kind of musty paper, but so now we have this collection of lovely renewed Scratch and Sniff cards from Joss, which is great. And then really the important thing is that we have the 5 1/4 discs. And I've got a microphone here so you can hear the lovely startup noises of the Apple IIc as I put everything in. Which I think is lovely. For some of you, a sound you've maybe never heard before. For others, a sound that's very nostalgic. And then we'll switch to a live feed. Pardon me for a second. I have too many windows open. So the fun thing about modern technology is I'm currently just using the Zoom window as the screen for the Apple IIc, because it has a composite video out and I can just run that into a USB converter. And it just sees it as a camera, which is really kind of great. If someone wants to explain Jerry Falwell, they should.
Feel free to unmute yourself, Simon, if you want.
Now, I didn't know if everyone would get the reference. I didn't know. Yeah, it was, I don't know how to describe it. It was just a, Jerry Falwell was a TV preacher and it was a political group. I don't know more to say about it. So not incredibly unlike some of the vibe we have today. But it was called the Moral Majority and was Jerry Falwell.
If you want, Libby, you can try and like set your age. I think you can do that by like doing lewd, and then you can give a number above 200.
So this choice of which restroom to enter was basically the way the game decided whether you're going to be playing the entire rest of the game as a male or as a female character.
Yes. If anybody knows Easter eggs that I should drop in, please tell me about them, because I don't know all of them for certain.
I think
acceptable age.
To potentially get people to experience number one altogether, and then like kind of kick off, I guess, a panel discussion. If you want to use the bathroom. And then you can do smell. So for everyone here, we can all now experience together smell number one. Sorry, Simon. And anyone who's currently in Sweden, I don't know why he hasn't gotten to you yet.
There's several of us here.
The challenges of international mail. It is not a terribly pleasant smell, Joss.
Yeah. When I first played it, I was kind of disgusted by it because I'm like, that's the smell of food. And I'm smelling it in a bathroom. Why?
So of course, I'll just read this one out loud for people and then we can get into the panel discussion. So you trace the smell to a dubious slice of pizza crumpled in a corner. Incidentally, we had some pretty putrid scents available, all of which would have seemed right at home in a filthy restroom. In the end, we were too kind to use them, but we were sorely tempted. So I think that kind of like frames our discussion. Exactly. So let me go ahead and pin people.
Correct.
So I'm going to start pinning, add pin, add pin.
So when I started playing this, and my first instinct was to eat the pizza. I'm like determined to see like, what is my character like? Yeah. Like, will she eat it? She has standards apparently. Exactly.
Need to find, and I'll add Libby also to the pins. So great.
Thank you.
So we're at a point where we're going to start just talking about other goddesses of Phobos and smells. And I think we have a bunch of random odd questions about this wonderful experience. If people haven't checked it out, we also did streams of the full game. Ash and I spent hours playing this, and the catacombs destroyed me. So yeah, does anyone want to start with a question?
The map.
Oh yeah, there's the map. Oh my god.
I was so confused by the map. But I'm really also bad with like spatial games like this too. I mean, I feel like my first question really is like, like where did the idea of this game even like come from? Like how did the design, like how did you think through the design of this? Like what were your inspirations, things like that?
Well, it was actually the title that came first. So have to actually go back a few years before the game itself. And Infocom was just getting started out, and we had a fairly small office, maybe 1,000 square feet. It was basically maybe 8 or so individual offices surrounding one large central room, which doubled as a conference room and also our micro room, where we had one of every PC, much like the room that Libya is in right now. And so this is late 82 now, and Infocom was having sort of its first social function of any kind, a small party, just for store owners and members of the press who happened to be in the Boston area. And so it was just like a beer and pizza party, and a few dozen people were expected. So it wasn't that big a deal, but it was sort of the first social thing of any kind that Infocom had done. And this room, in addition to the conference table and all the PCs, it also had one wall that was, floor to ceiling, wall to wall chalkboard. And on that chalkboard was this huge grid. And across the top was every type of PC, Apple II and Atari 400 and IBM PC and so on. And then down the side were all the games, Zork 1, Zork 2, Starcross, Deadline. And then that grid was filled in with what version of the game was currently in release on that particular PC. Because the game would constantly be updated as bugs were reported. And so it was important to know, this version is out on Atari, this version is out, on the NEC APC or what have you. And therefore you would know, are those players experiencing this bug or not experiencing this bug? So shortly before this party happened, I went into that room and added a line to this chart for Leather Goddesses of Phobos as, another Infocom game, and sort of filled in fake version numbers all through the chart. And our president, Joel Perez, saw it just before people were about to arrive and leapt across the room and erased that line. But the name kind of stuck around, and people were always kind of using it jokingly around Infocom for the years that followed. And in 1985, when I had just finished A Mind Forever Voyaging, and was starting to think about what would I work on next, I sort of said, everyone really loves the name. It has stuck around for years as something that people are constantly bringing up. Why don't we actually create Leather Goddesses of Phobos? And so I started working on it. And so it all started with the name. And then I was like, okay, what is a game with that name going to be like? And I thought, okay, it's going to be kind of a silly R-rated spoof of kind of, classic pulpy science fiction, Flash Gordon-y sorts of scenarios. And started creating that game. And over the course of creating the game, Infocom, which had gotten into financial trouble by trying to do a non-game, a database called Cornerstone, and ended up, in order to survive, having to sell itself to Activision. And so our CEO, Al Veza, who was on the Cornerstone side of the company, not really on the game side, was showing Jim Levy around, who was the CEO of Activision. And they came to the creative services department, where the group was working on material for Leather Goddesses of Phobos. And And so Jim Levy, the CEO of Activision, sort of picked that up and looked at it, and Alveza quickly said, of course that name isn't final yet. We haven't completely decided that that's what we're going with. And Jim Levy said, what? I wouldn't call it anything else. And at that point, everyone felt much better about getting acquired by Activision. Anyway, so that's sort of the origin story of the game.
So I bet like people have this question as well, and we've talked about this previously. It's just like, when did smells become, what led you to that? What kind of made you like be like, ah, yes, a scratch and sniff card is what I need for Love the Goddesses of Phobos?
I'm not really too sure kind of what the initial thinking was. It was not too long after Polyester had come out. So, I'm sure that that was part of the genesis of the idea. And at Infocom, we always had very elaborate packaging, starting with our first mystery game, Deadline, where the package was basically this sort of entire portfolio of detective materials that you might get if you were assigned to a case. So we were always looking for, things to make the package interesting, both just as a selling piece and also, to act as an anti-piracy device. So sometimes there were things in the package that made it hard to play the game without having the package, but also just made the package something you would want to own. And, just having the game code by itself without the package wouldn't feel like a complete experience. So the scratch and sniff card was certainly kind of part of the thinking early on, but I really don't have any recollection of that kind of one moment when I said, I'm doing a scratch and sniff card.
And then to follow up on that, like, how did you decide what types of smells to add into the game? Like, I'm just still like coming back to that first moment of like, oh man, there's pizza in the bathroom. What other types of smells are going to be happening in this game? Which I thought a lot of them were really great. So yeah, I'm curious about which smells you wanted, which smells you didn't want.
Yeah. Well, so once we decided that we were going to have the scratch and sniff card, so we had a creative services department, and there was a woman there, Angela, who basically spent weeks, if not months, on the production of this scratch and sniff card. And that's what makes, the fact that you got this done so impressive, I think, is just, I know how much work she put into getting the card produced. And not only that, but getting it produced within budget, because we had a budget of something like 30 cents for it. And so at the time, there was only one or maybe two companies that produced scratch and sniff inks. And so we got ours from 3M, and she got a list of all the scents they had. They had about 500 kind of on the shelf scents. And I got that list and then narrowed it down to about 30 that looked like they would be most suitable for the game. And so I gave her that list, and she got from 3M basically a sample of each of those scents that was about the size of an index card. And it had the scent printed across the whole sheet, and then the name of the scent printed at the bottom. So I just, scheduled lots of Infocom employees to come in one at a time into my office, and I would blindfold them because the name of the scent was on the card. So they had to be blindfolded or they would see it. And then I would have them scratch each of those 30 scents and then have them basically tell me, what do you think that scent is? And so by doing that, I was able to find the scents that were most easily identifiable, and kind of kept score across the maybe 20 people or so who I eventually had come in and do that test. And so there were some scents, that I had really high hopes for. There was one that was called New Car, and I thought that would be fun to, to have a brand new spaceship and have it have new car scent. But it ended up smelling like nothing. No one could identify New Car as a New Car smell. So that was one that I sadly had to abandon. So for the most part, of the 7 scents that ended up on the card, 6 of them were pretty close to the most identifiable scents from that test. And the only one that wasn't a real high score that I ended up using was leather, which I felt was worth using despite its, fairly low success rate in that test.
And panelists, feel free to keep yourselves unmuted. It's okay. I don't think it's going to be like a problem. We'd have to be like a stilted conversation. So just a quick thing, 2 things for the audience. If people don't know what polyester is a movie from the 80s, queer iconic film with drag queen Divine as the titular character, that was produced with 10 odors and scratch and sniff, usually very negative odors like farts and things like that, kind of playing on subversion. And we will have spoilers in this conversation. So if you've never played the game or haven't followed the stream, this is just a warning that you might be hearing some stuff about it. So I'm kind of curious about if you remember anything about the design process for the card, and especially in terms of what you said with the pricing. So a lot of cards in the 80s, for example, and books also, scratch and sniff books, used stickers as a means to like reduce the cost. And the original Leather Goddesses of Phobos cards have actually screen printing, which is such a like almost luxurious process in printing when you're screen printing like that many odors. I was curious like if this was part of the thought process for the quality of the feelies or things like that.
Yeah, well, Mike Dornbrook, who's on the call, was a lot more involved with the actual production of the card. Maybe he'd like to jump in.
Yeah, if you're here, say so in the chat and I will unmute you and actually pin you so you can join the panel discussion for a bit.
In the meantime, Mike also chatted to me that I should point out a couple of interesting things about that testing. One was that there was a slight difference between genders. Women were slightly better at identifying smells than men, but the much more stark difference was non-smokers were far, far better at identifying smells than smokers were.
And I have to admit that you have to repeat the question because I was so busy typing to Steve that I missed part of it.
No worries. So I was just curious, like with the design of the card, what kind of considerations there were. Kind of like so Ariana and I were chatting about this at one point, and there's like an expectation of like it seems like there's an expectation of the Infocom feelies to be like almost quite fantastic production level for the cost. And I was curious, were things like screen printing versus using stickers a consideration for the card?
Boy, that's a hard thing to remember.
It's a very detailed question.
I do recall that the initial budgets that were coming in were just insanely too high. I mean, we could not possibly, justify them. And we literally, Angela gave up more than one occasion and she was not someone to give up easily, but she came to me and said, Mike, this is just not doable. And I so badly wanted that card for Steve that I kept telling her, go try again, keep trying. And she so drove the folks nuts, calling them about this, that they finally just gave us the scents. They didn't charge us for them. They called it a sample run, because we weren't doing, like they were used to doing like multi-million runs for like perfume ads and magazines. And we were only trying to do like 50,000 of them or something. So for them, this was like a tiny, tiny run. So they gave them all 7 cents came as samples, for testing a print run. And we never had to pay for them.
I do remember that the number of spots was a big sticking point. And for a while, it looked like we were only going to be able to have 6. And then maybe it was that, that change that allowed us to kick up to 7.
I remember there were printing issues also, but I can't remember the details, unfortunately.
Well, I remember that basically for each scent, it was basically like another color of ink, and the card had to go through the press another time for each scent. So even if the ink itself was free, there was the labor of changing the press over to the new, ink, and then and then running the cards through again.
Yeah, it was really complicated.
I have a
That's-
question about the card. Also, the text, the disclaimer text, the under penalty text. Can you say a little bit about that? It's not too dissimilar from the polyester odorama card, and I'm just curious where that came from.
Oh, I mean, I guess I was just worried that, you know, someone would open the package and then immediately scratch all 7 cents rather than waiting until that point in the game when you're prompted to. And, you know, certainly there would be a great temptation on the part of players to do that. And so I just wanted something both humorous and strongly worded to urge players not to do that.
Did you hear of any cases where that happened? Was there any feedback from players where you heard people, yeah, as soon as I got it, I sniffed everyone?
No, but you know, we had a similar situation with Invisiclues, which were the invisible ink hint books that Mike invented back actually even before he was an employee of Infocom. He had a separate company called the Zerk Users Group, and there was, you know, well, basically the entire idea of those was that people wanted just enough of a hint that they needed to progress and not have the whole kind of puzzle given away to them, but that it was you know, that simply the questions themselves could sort of give away information, and we didn't want people, you know, kind of seeing questions even with the answers undeveloped that would kind of give stuff away to them and tell them about things that were coming up. And so those hint books were always strewn with kind of fake questions that had nothing to do with the game, so in order to discourage players from, you know, kind of looking ahead.
So I also see that Betty's mentioning that Ernie might also be remembering things. So I've changed the settings of the meeting because I don't think anyone's gonna unmute themselves and spam things. So feel free, if you need to jump in and want to say something and you remember things, feel free to jump in. I'm also curious for anyone, like Michael or Ernie or Betty, if you remember doing that smell test or like details about it. I'm very curious about how it was structured.
I vaguely remember, but only vaguely.
Yeah, all my notes from that test, the, you know, actual recording of people's answers would have been in my Leather Goddess's notebook, which about 12 years ago or so I donated to the game archive at Stanford University. So it would still be there, you know, in a box in their sub basement. I always picture the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
So let me see. I think there was some questions about like what in the game itself, you actually have two functions that you've developed. You have a scratch and sniff function for odors that are included, but you also include the opposite, which is a very interesting choice. I was curious if you remember anything about that. You have a no scratch and sniff function for a couple of the odors.
No, I don't really recall that. I mean, perhaps those were odors that were originally programmed into the game, and then as the production of the card indicated that there would be fewer odors, then I changed them over to that mode, but I really don't have any recollection.
No worries. Ariana, any questions?
Thank you for trying to unmute me. I'm dealing with a new laptop, and it's a whole new world of touchscreen joy, but also confusion. Yeah, I was as I was playing, I was thinking back to some work that Jazz and I have been doing around like the sort of ambiguity of smells. So I was really tickled to hear that you had to do some kind of test, and interested to hear that you chose scents that were the most recognizable to your players. But one of the things that I was noticing as I was playing is a sort of relationship between smell and text, and that oftentimes the hint to smell was also accompanied by like several reinforcements or contextualizations of what that smell was. And so I guess I'm wondering, as a design principle for including smell in games, like how necessary was the like reinforcement of this is in fact pizza, not like, you know, poop or something in the bathroom. Like how necessary did it become to reinforce or like kind of like contextualize the smell properly for players versus allowing there to be some kind of ambiguity around that? Like I particularly noticed this in the mothballs smell, where like you didn't just smell it once, it said it kind of like 2 or 3 times in the course of several passages that it was indeed mothballs. Like what inspired, was that a design, I'm going to rephrase, was it a design necessity to have that kind of closure for the smells? Or yeah, why?
Well, I think the fact that even in the best cases, you know, there were no smells, you know, that were sort of 100% recognizable. And so, you know, I didn't feel I could just have the smell and leave it to explain itself. But my recollection is that there were some times where, you know, I said, you know, okay, you're in a room and it smells like mothballs, scratch here, and then you would smell mothballs. But then there are other cases where you would just sort of arrive at a room, be prompted to smell, and then at a point not knowing what you were going to smell, and then, you know, that moment would then lead into kind of a description of what was going on, or you know, an explanation of what you just smelled. But the mothballs were a really interesting one. I remember probably my favorite moment during that testing was when I gave someone the mothballs card and they scratched it and just got this sort of silly grin on their face and said, "Grandma's attic." And it was sort of indicative of how, you know, the connection between smell and memory and nostalgia.
And honestly, while playing that was my experience when smelling the mothballs. I remember us having this conversation on Twitch where some people were like, "This smells like a urine cake," and I was like, "I don't even know what that smells like. I don't go to a bathroom that has urine cake." So I'm like, "What is going on?" But I do remember distinctly, like, this smelled like something that my grandmother would have in her house, like one of those like oil containers that had like the wicks, like I don't know, like the wooden bamboo wicks that would push out scent.
A reed diffuser.
A reed diffuser. I had no idea what they're even called. I'm just like, my grandma has these things. And because it smells so much like my grandmother, but also it wouldn't make sense for a reed diffuser to be in a closet, my only thought was like, it has an older scent. What is the thing that my grandmother would also have? Which it would definitely be a mothball. Well, I think my mom would now use something like cedar chips or something like that, but my grandmother would specifically use a mothball. So yeah, it was really interesting as an experience.
And kind of like expanding on that moment, it really, the scent of mothballs, that's where you pick up the basket, the wicker basket. And it did this funny, one of the interesting things about knowing for certain that it was mothballs is that actually told me something about the way that the basket looked. Whereas like, because objects in this sci-fi world, you know, like the barge in my mind is like kind of like a boat, but also kind of space agey with these like orange and purple buttons. But there was something about the wicker basket being contextualized in the smell world of mothballs. Which like kind of helped me problem solve a little bit or contextualize the objects that could fit in the basket or not. I don't know. I think it's the ways that the smells kind of lend to these like memory, but also narrative colors when you can't see the world, when we don't get the graphics, we just have this other way of intuiting what the world looks and acts like.
And that just dovetails well with one of the strengths of text games, in that, you know, with the briefest description like wicker basket, players could read so much more detail into it than, you know, frankly, we had the ability to put in text because we were so limited, having to make a game fit on a 100K or so floppy disk.
So one of the things I wanted to jump on this conversation about, especially the order of cues. So for people that are maybe not as familiar with smell, smell is something that's very hard to identify without any additional cues to lend and frame what the odor is. So you could read things like odor number 3 as the urinal cake or the mothball, depending on context, in part because urinal cakes actually have the same active ingredient as mothballs at one point, which was naphthalene, as a friend pointed out, which is why it has like the same smell. But you really play on, I guess this is less of a question, it's more of a comment, you really play on this kind of ambiguity of cues in the textual context. So like the bathroom, you're not sure what it is. I think the pizza is described, but you don't know what you're going to be focusing on. And Jesse was also pointing out that the use of the leather was a very clever one, in that I think it's the only odor that kind of actually lends itself to the plot directly, right? You only know that it's the leather goddesses of Phobos at first from odor when you go into the divan.
Right, because I think you're in the
So that
dark,
was an
if I
interesting
recall.
cue. Exactly, yeah. One question that I'm going to steal from Simon, or if Simon wants to also add to it, because I think it's relevant right now, is did incorporating odors into the game change how you actually expressed yourself or stylized words? So I've seen someone talk about how in Leather Goddesses of Phobos, this is an instance where you kind of matured in your writing and description in text-based adventures, and that you had a process, I think, with one of your collaborators, like giving a list of verbs, and they would give like adverbs or suggested alternatives to kind of change the language. I'm kind of curious, like, when you were writing, did you keep in mind that there was these extra modalities to take into consideration, even if you weren't going to give the odor for
Yeah,
it?
well, I think what you're referring to is the work that John Pallas did, who I think is on the call. He, basically went through all the text in the game and suggested kind of double entendres to substitute for, some of the text that I had already written. But as far as the sense itself, I mean, that was such a rare moment. I mean, there were 7 cents, and playing the game is probably like 30 or 40 hours. So so any kind of moment in the game that involved one of the scratch and sniff spots was fairly rare, and with hours and hours of gameplay in between. But I think that first one that we already did in the restroom was kind of an example of how sense and language could kind of play together. So you went into the restroom and the description just said, there is a stool here. And the double meaning of stool, particularly in the concept of a restroom, kind of sets you up then, even though, the stool turns out to be the furniture type of stool, that then when there's something unidentifiable in the corner and you're asked to smell it, I think puts the idea in the player's mind that this, could be something much more problematic than just a piece of abandoned pizza.
I wanted to follow up on that with another question that came up among the panelists while we were preparing, and it certainly came up with Jazz and Ashlyn when they were doing the playthrough, which is about the pacing. And you sort of mentioned this now. There's basically 3 set cues that happen fairly quickly, and then it depends how you play the game, but there's kind of a cluster towards the end, and there's a long period in the middle where you may come across something. But how did you think about the pacing of the scent cues in the game?
Well, I wanted them to be reasonably spaced out to try to avoid the, I've gone 15 hours without ever, experiencing a new scent. But I also wanted them to be slightly front stacked so that, you kind of get, 1 or 2 within your first session of playing the game. And then the fact that one of the scents was leather, and that you didn't meet the leather goddesses until essentially the final scene of the game kind of pegged when that one would occur. So, given that I wanted to have a few right up front and then that one right at the end, kind of constrained the decision, especially I don't remember how many I originally hoped to have. Maybe the fact that polyester had 10, kind of indicates what I might have been thinking when I first started designing the game. And the fact that we ended up at 7, and in fact for a while, I think the answer from the creative services production was that it was actually going to be only 6, pretty much constrained where those scents would occur during the experience.
Sorry, there's like some fun conversation in the chat. And for everyone, I'm going to quickly read also what Dave Thompson included, which was a list of some of the other odors that were considered: skunk, peanut butter, grapefruit, bubblegum, whipped cream, mushroom, new car, anchovy martini, fried chicken. I didn't even know that they produce some of those odors, which is quite fascinating. And it's, for people, this is kind of like a neat fact, I guess, that Simon and I were chatting about, which is contextually, this is around the time that the first smell test was actually developed in the 80s, which is called the University of Pennsylvania Smell Identification Test. So for me, it's kind of like me fangirling and freaking out about like, it's interesting that you were, Steve, like doing a similar test independently while like these smell researchers were essentially using a similar structure to try and identify and measure people's ability to smell. And you even said that like, oh yeah, smokers were not having a great time. And that's one of the results from that paper. Anyways, I'll mute myself because I could go on about this. Any other questions from Ash or Simon or Ryan about stuff?
I was going to ask, I was curious, Steve, to know a little bit more about, I don't know much about games journalism or game reviews in 1986. I'm just curious about what any sort of critical reception was about especially about the scent aspect of the game.
Nothing that comes to mind that was, particularly out of the ordinary. I do recall that the Leather Goddesses package won the award from the Software Publishers Association that year for best packaging.
I will also add that was I think the last year that they did it where it was across all types of packaging. So it was business, entertainment, everything. We had best packaging across everything.
That's impressive. Sorry, just wanted to say that. Let's see. I'm like going through our discussion document at the same time, so feel free, anyone else, to jump in, and I'll check what other people are asking.
One of the things that I was thinking about in this playthrough, I did like a weird speed playthrough where I tried to use a walkthrough and see if I could play through the entire game in less than 2 hours, which was actually like a very weird experience. But one of the things in compressing the game in such a short amount of time, I was hit with was the amount of like sort of meta-ludic. I'm struggling to find exactly what the word is here, but there's this sort of like meta-referentiality where the game would speak about itself as a game, particularly with reference to the smell, which I thought was so interesting because there are moments, it felt like the way that the smell card was treated in relationship to the game felt different than the relationship between the maps or other like code moments, like encryption moments, where we know that we need to, in order to advance, we need to appeal to this map, which we can only get in the box. But the box, it's diegetic, whereas somehow there are these moments where you address, like, we could have put a different smell here, but we couldn't. Or I think it was a cedarwood smell where it talks about it not being able to be smelled, but it would be nice if we could smell it or something.
Yeah. Well, my friend Bob Bates, who is another of the Infocom game designers, he likes to talk about kind of the relationship between the Infocom authors and the players as kind of a dialogue or a contest of wills. That the way the games were designed kind of made it feel like you as an individual player was was sort of going head to head against the author of the game. And so, I think going all the way back to the original Zork, I think there are a lot of those moments where the game kind of winks at you, and has these kind of breaking the fourth wall moments. And definitely did a lot of that in Hitchhiker's Guide. And then one thing that I introduced in Hitchhiker's Guide and also used in Leather Goddesses was the idea of footnotes. And so there would be, it would just say footnote 17, and then for, at the next command prompt, you would type footnote 17, and then there would be an aside that was typically the game kind of speaking directly to you as the player. And of course, because of that, you could just go through and start typing footnote 1, footnote 2, footnote 3. And so I had a footnote that was never referenced anywhere in the game, footnote 15 or footnote 13 or something. And when you type that one in, the response was, "Isn't it fun just reading through all the footnotes?" So yeah, that was one of the wonderful things about the, text games in general, but also just the sort of Infocom gestalt.
And I see Libby's actually pulling up the screen, so if you wanted to look at that kind of commentary, and I find it fascinating, the timing of this kind of like character break of the game, or game break, or fourth wall breaking, because scratch and sniff cards, at least in film, is often framed or angled as like a distraction to the media, where it kind of breaks you from the media and kind of disrupts that flow. And it's just, I guess one of my questions is like, was that a consideration for this timing for the comments? Like, people are out, kind of like pulled out of the game or alienated from the game by having to pull out the card and smell it and then look back at their screen, and then you kind of make the comment right afterwards.
Well, as I said, the Infocom games often or almost always had these sorts of ancillary elements that you had to kind of take yourself away from the game to interact with. Code wheels, maps, calendars, encyclopedias, the scratch and sniff card, of course, the 3D comic, had clues in it that you needed to get through the maze. And so certainly in some cases that worked better than others. As I mentioned, really the first example of this was the package for Deadline, which had this whole portfolio of clues and reports and fingerprints and interviews with suspects and things like that. And partly that was just because the size of the executable itself was so incredibly constrained that this allowed the story to be considerably deeper than would be possible if everything had to be contained within the executable itself. But also, I think it just made for a more multimedia experience, and that drawing you away from the game and interacting with printed text or maps or things like that actually enhanced the experience rather than kind of broke the experience or detracted from the experience.
I'm very taken by the idea of the conversation between Infocom as a kind of computer DM or game master to the players. And it makes me wonder, to what degree were the design decisions about that transmedia world around the game related to other gaming experiences or other storytelling games that you all were playing? To me, I see a relationship between Zork and Dungeons and Dragons. But I guess I know I'm getting a little bit away from the scent bit, but it just, there's something to me about that conversation that, it strikes me as so interesting to say, we're going to do this with the computer. We're going to talk with the computer.
Well,
it's
definitely
linking. Yeah.
D&D is sort of the experience from which the original Adventure kind of drew its inspiration, and then Zork drew its inspiration then from Adventure. But then in another branch, kind of all of the role-playing games, Wizardry and Ultima and things like that, kind of also came out of that. And I would say by Leather Goddess's days, our main inspiration was sort of each other and other adventure games. So we were certainly looking at what companies like Sierra were doing, but also each of us, there were 6 or 7 of us writing games, and we were all playing each other's games, and I think having a big influence on each other.
So I'm going to grab some of the questions about, oh yeah, I'm getting a bunch of DMs with questions. So first, let's jump over to Dave's. I think, where is it? Oh yeah, so Dave was just asking for Steve and Mike, like, how did Leather Goddesses of Phobos do in sales? And did you actually consider it a success at the time? And maybe in hindsight also, you can probably, if that differs in hindsight or things like that.
I think it was the best-selling game in the second half of Infocom's history. If you think of like from 85 to 89, I don't think anything did better than it.
Yeah, my recollection was 70,000 in the first year, which certainly was nothing like Zork or Hitchhikers, but you know, was certainly good for that period when text adventures were losing their luster and, you know, the player base was gravitating toward graphic adventures.
Yeah, my memory is 72,000 for some reason. And I think that, didn't we do a solid gold version of it also?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so that would have added another 50 to 75,000 more on top of that, I think.
Yeah, at like $15 instead of $40.
Right, and then Activision told us, you know, after they shut down Infocom and they went through bankruptcy and Bobby Kotick re-released the Infocom games, he did the Lost Treasures. I'm not sure if, is Leather Goddesses in Lost Treasures?
It might be that they held it out because we were working on Leather Goddesses 2, and I think they re-released it all by itself.
Because Lost Treasures alone did 100,000 copies that first year. And then they started re-releasing all the games. They would do science fiction packs and various packs. And somebody from Activision told me in the late 90s that there wasn't a single Infocom game that had sold less than 300,000 copies by that point because of all the extra sales they had made subsequent.
Anyway, there are numbers that don't sound that impressive by today's standards, but you know, basically to be a #1 bestseller in those days would be maybe selling 250,000 copies. So 70,000 was, you know, pretty good numbers for 1986.
Yeah.
Simon?
I have a question for everyone present who can feel free to respond in chat. I just wanted to ask, for those of you who've played through the game or have memories of the game, what is the Leather Goddess of Phobos environment you would most like to smell that's not associated with a scent cue? And which one would you least like to smell? And I'll start. I mean, you spend so much time in the canals and, you know, you're getting in and out of the barges and rafts. And I imagine a big, slow moving red river, big muddy red river. And I'd like to smell that. So I'm just curious, anyone else wants to just add anything to chat, please do so.
I guess the same question could be asked to Steve. They're like, is there any space in like that you like wish you could have had like a weird odor that you could have had?
Cleveland.
Cleveland.
1986, which would have been more pungent perhaps too.
Cleveland is a cursed city. I say that as a person from Pennsylvania. I really would have liked to smell like Venus. I think in like the kind of jungle where the Venus flytrap was. Just thinking about like the smell of a jungle, but also kind of like maybe some of the weird atmospheric scents that might be found in like the Venetian like atmosphere. Like I don't actually even know what it comprises of, but like part of me was thinking it would smell a little bit like rotten eggs, and I'm thinking maybe because of sulfur or something. I don't know. So that's what I would have liked to smell.
I'm seeing responses of, yeah, Venus atmosphere plus fly trap. Cleveland also. A love-hate relationship with that one in Venus. Lots of methane. Yeah, that's a good point. I guess part of like one of the questions I have is like, if you remember this, is in the design or the incorporation of odors, I guess why use them only one time?
Well, I guess most of my thinking was that the revelation, you know, oh, that's what number 6 is, you know, that would be most of the joy that you would get from it. You know, it wasn't so much trying to create this multi-sensory environment that you were going to be playing in. there also might have been concern, that since basically when you break open those bubbles, they're gone forever, that, there's only so much life in a scratch and sniff card.
That's interesting. And the frog, I think I would have to go with the frog in terms of like things I'd probably want to try and smell. It was apparently such an unappealing creature in the space that we had to block all of our senses. So that's a great question. That's a great one. So one of the questions is from Jesse in the audience, who's asking, so the game has a lot of really interesting challenges that require information beyond what's included. I think the question's like asking, especially, how did people receive that need for other, like, did people enjoy having to reference a bunch of feelies on the side? And did Infocom keep cranking that up across games? Or like, is there like self-competition? Like you have to outdo your previous self in this kind of production?
I think there was some of that, but we were pretty limited. I mean, if I recall, the sort of total contents of the feely section of the game package had a budget of maybe 75 cents. And I think there were a few budget busters. My recollection is there was a sort of a encyclopedia in I'm blanking. It was the game that Brian Moriarty did right after Trinity, that was set in the Zork universe, Beyond Zork. I think it was called Beyond Zork. And yeah, I think that element, that was a really nice, kind of gold embossed, like 24-page booklet or something, and that was a bit of a budget buster. But for the most part, yeah, we wanted to, sort of continue topping ourselves, and particularly just doing new things, that we hadn't done before, and not doing just another, of a map or, a booklet of some kind or what have you. And in fact, I still have in my desk kind of a folder called Feely Ideas, which is just filled with things like those things that look like a piece of cardboard, but then you dip them in water and they turn into a sponge, or, these sort of things that look like, just like a little capsule, and you put them in hot water and the capsule part dissolves, and then poof, it turns into like a little styrofoam dinosaur or something. So yeah, I mean, had we continued and continued to have sort of the budget to do these things, we would have always been looking for more ideas like that.
One question that I have, I think Simon probably shares with me, is it's two questions that I'm going to ask like simultaneously. At the time, did you see odor being added to the game as purely a gimmick? And do you think that odors in video games, this is kind of stealing from Avery Gilbert, do you think that in the future smells can ever be anything else than a gimmick in game design?
I would say that I saw it as a gimmick. I mean, because it was so, such a tiny sort of sliver of the experience, it really couldn't be much more than a gimmick. So if there was any way to make it more pervasive, and I think I smell, had that caught on, could have been such a way where smells could have been something that were, if not constant throughout the game experience, at least much more prevalent than, 7 moments spread over several tens of hours.
Yeah, and I was just writing the context for that. I smell it, for people who don't know. I smell is a device that was proposed by a startup called DigiSense, 1999/2000s, that didn't end up taking off. There was like some embroilment. Simon could talk about that. But yeah, so that's interesting. So in some sense, like the format is essentially what's keeping it from breaking the threshold of being a gimmick. And so that's interesting.
I would also even think about the synthetic nature of the like scratch and sniff, because it's printed, it's ink. There's something about smell where like the overall experience would have to be rethought a bit to really make this work. I think of like alternate reality games being a great vehicle for this, where you're, you know, playing in the real world and you can use actual like real sense. If you're in a space and there's something that's supposed to be burning, you could just burn like actual wood as opposed to using a synthetic smell of like burning wood, right? So I think rethinking the overall like idea and really bringing in smells to the forefront, and then really thinking about how you would get that across could really kind of move the field forward. But I think it's a bit difficult because it requires a lot more in terms of production, I think, to really push this along. But I don't think the idea is bad. I just think I'm actually very excited to continue to play more like scratch and sniff games, because I'm really interested in thinking about like how can you build out more. And I'll use immersive, but we're not going to really talk about what that means at this moment. Like I really cannot get into this, but like, you know, more experiences that incorporate more of your senses, right? If we're really good at building out the spectacle, the visual spectacle of games with the digital aspects of things, right? And we have, you know, theater incorporated into this, embodiment incorporated to this, touch incorporated to this. How can we actually utilize smell? Right? I think of murder mystery dinner parties, right, as a way that you can incorporate smell, or, you know, some of the 4D experiences that happen in Disney that sort of kind of incorporated smell. And so, yeah, how can we really build an integrated experience?
You would think that location-based entertainment like Disney, you just mentioned Disney, would be an opportunity for smell that would be more affordable than pretty much any other. You know, before you could do it for television or, you know, movie theater or whatever, you could do it for the, you know, multi-million-dollar, you know, experience at a Disney World or whatever. And I'm not aware of whether that's been done. Does anybody know anything about that? Is that
Yeah, like for example, the ride Soarin', which is at both California Adventure and at Epcot. It's basically you're in sort of flying seats and seeing a big IMAX movie of shots of aerial photography over California. And they use scents in that, like you go over a pine forest and they use the scent of the pine forest. But, you know, I think the problem with that usage is both getting the scent out in a timely fashion into a huge space and then clearing it away in a timely fashion when that scene ends.
Yeah, that's super on point. And at least for Disney, so the device that they use oftentimes is called the Smellitzer. And for anyone who wants to look it up afterwards, that's basically it. And they thought about using smell earlier on. Tammy goes on about this, Tammy Bernstock, in Fantasia. So Fantasia was originally supposed to have odors, and they scrapped it due to price issues. So it's an interesting, like, recurring issue, is just even the cost of materials and formulation is hard, especially for things like scratch and sniff, because depending on the delivery format or the diffusion method, you might have to completely reformulate your stuff. So for microencapsulation, you have to take into consideration things like how hydrophobic the material is, because you want it to dissolve more in octanol, which is a kind of like an alcohol, than water. And so that way it can create tiny droplets that are suspended in water that a wall could form around, depending on how you produce those things. But yeah, there's people like mentioning odors and like experiences like that. So like the King Kong ride for kids had a banana scent that was diffused. Disney's Horizon ride at Epcot had oranges. I think there was also a Pirates of the Caribbean ride that had a very distinctive water odor that was then turned into like a perfume because people remembered it so much that they were like, oh, I want to wear this and remember it. I totally forgot the question I was going to ask, but I guess one of the questions is, did you ever think about the scratch and sniff card as like, so like a lot of people think about smell as a question of memory, like, oh, you can use smell to trigger people's memories, but did you ever envision the card and these odors as a means for people to kind of re-experience elements of Leather Goddesses of Phobos after they're done playing?
No, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that is, you know, kind of, you know, in the same way that, say, the hint booklet had always a section at the end that was fun stuff you might not have tried. That was, sort of another way to continue experiencing the game after you were done playing it. I imagine that after a lot of people finished playing the game, then they would go through and just scratch all the spots in order and say, oh yeah, right, I remember when that happened.
And I guess another follow-up for this is, so like, it seems like people in the audience, I'm kind of curious if people, how often people experience scented media, right? Because we don't necessarily all have a similar reference point for use cases of odors. And I was curious, Steve, like, did you ever think about referencing polyester through odor or things like that? Like, there is reference in Other Goddesses of Phobos to like mythology. That's also like in Zork with like the Cyclops and things like that. But I'm curious, were there ever thoughts about like olfactory reference or stuff like that?
I don't recall thinking about referencing polyester, maybe because of concerns, that unlike, say, Greek mythology, that was someone's current IP, but also probably I was embarrassed that I had kind of ripped the idea off from them and didn't want to do anything to draw attention to that fact.
I mean, in thinking about the reference point for it, it's as we were talking about all of these other examples of like Disneyland, Epcot, smell experiences, having some kind of relationship to this. I've been thinking a lot about, because someone mentioned Sleep No More, the relationship between this is like a theatrical mode, like how you're describing it as a gimmick, but there's like a way in which playing this as a performance studies scholar, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, Artaud, total, like theater of cruelty. Of course, we're being asked to smell things because we're also being asked to do so many interactive things. So were there any other I guess like cultural touch points that made like smell, I don't know, like was it smell just like any other feely, or was there a sense that this was in some way like more immersive, like it engaged the body more in the act of play?
Well, I mean, it was certainly the first time we had used that scent. Never really used taste that I could think of, although one of the things in the deadline package was this little plastic envelope with a label on it that said pills found near the body. And they were actually just some candy, sweet tarts or something. And so they were, in fact, perfectly fine to eat, although I doubt most players did, either from fear that they weren't edible or just not wanting to destroy, an element of your package. But I do remember when Infocom got shut down in '89 and just huge dumpsters outside the office were being filled with thousands and thousands of packages. I remember rescuing a box full of deadlines and just breaking them open to get at the sweet tarts.
Incredible.
Now that's a Proust moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, other than the fact that, we were sort of breaking into a new sense that hadn't been used before, I don't think, that it was thought of any differently.
I guess Simon and I were chatting about this morning because we were having a meeting about something else, but Simon, feel free to jump in on this one. I guess like one of the odors is actually hinged or like kind of grounded on gender flipping as well. So the perfume / cologne odor appears in the harem and then is recontextualized because your gender choice changes whether or not you're talking to husbands or like an army of clone wives or clone husbands. I guess like was that ever a thought, like, oh, the gender is going to change impression of odor? Or were you kind of like, I think Simon was saying that like, oh, this is almost like imagining like a unisex odor before CK1 ever came out in the 90s.
Yeah, I'd say more the latter. I mean, keeping in mind with the whole gender change thing, I mean, that was like kind of ridiculously ambitious given, as I said, the entire executable was something like 110 kilobytes. And anytime, that any of us worked on a game, we were always right at the limit. And usually the last 2 or 3 months of working on a game, it was a constant battle. A bug would be reported and you'd have to add a fix that would take 20 bytes, and you'd have to cut something out, just a couple of words here or there that would save you 20 bytes so that you could put that fix in. And so the amount of kind of leeway to add this, sort of two gender stuff was super limited, and a lot of them, were really, if you look at the code, there's just sort of like 2 letters get added, if you're playing as a woman versus playing as a man, or vice versa. So yeah, certainly getting into, a lot of gender differences that weren't really differences was certainly the way I handled a lot of stuff.
So I have a question based on sort of the connection between scent and memory. Steve, when you smelled Jazz's reconstructed card, was there any particular memories that came back from the creation of the game itself, or the design process, or?
Yeah,
anything?
well, I mean, the only one that I've scratched so far is spot 1. And I do recall, that when I was doing the testing for that spot, a lot of people identified it as pizza, but then there were a lot of people, who just said oregano, or, some other spice. And scratching it just now, made me kind of relive that moment, because, it definitely, I think it's hard for me to say what I would have done, had I not known it was pizza, but I certainly got the oregano pretty strongly.
That's one of the, I think it's the only scent that's shared with polyester also. I think there's also a pizza in that too, or not as well.
Yeah, interesting. I never saw polyester, or
you
I mean, I knew of their scratch and sniff card, but I've never actually experienced it.
would recommend. Sorry, I interrupted you, Ash.
No, I think where my surprise is that I think I assumed that you had experience I don't know polyester. Like, I also recently learned about it. And I'm like, wow, there's a whole generation of stuff that I'm just like very excited to explore. But I've heard that one of the references for this game was polyester. But it's interesting to me that you haven't played or experienced, not played, like watched or experienced polyester, and then have designed this game. And it's just like, because I'm thinking like, some of my independent game developer friends, like most people who are like, oh, this game was the inspiration. They like played this game. In fact, probably a little too much. They probably are doing some weird referential stuff with it because they play this game too much, and they end up making a copycat. But that's a whole nother issue within the game industry. But yeah, I just found it fascinating. It's like, oh, here is something that is doing something similar, but you as designer haven't experienced that. And I'm like, oh, that's great. It's interesting.
Yeah,
so there's no question there. It's mainly just that, oh.
Certainly by the time I was working on Leather Goddesses, polyester had long since come and gone. And, like today, I'm sure I could find polyester somewhere, but I wouldn't be able to experience it with the scent.
I'm going to say this out loud just because this is a great conversation discussion that's happening in the chat. Lori was asking if there's any info about the percentage of women versus men who played the game when it came out, because like this is spot on. Scratch and sniff stickers were mostly collected by girls. Like a lot of them were kind of advertised for young girls at the time, and you would have like books and collectors books kind of being produced. And Michael actually went ahead and answered that one. So Michael's saying that research in 1984 timeframe that indicated 25% of Infocom buyers were women, and this compared well to our competition like EA games were like 90 to 95%. And actually, I think this is like a comment that Ash and I made when we finished the game. We were both kind of like pleasantly surprised by how enjoyable it was, like regardless. Like it wasn't like, I know some stuff about Leisure Suit Larry, and I know that it's like intensely like macho, but Leather Goddesses of Phobos still feels like there's still like an angle that's kind of geared towards men, but it isn't overwhelming to the point that it feels kind of distancing or alienating on that front. More of a comment, sorry.
Exactly. I definitely didn't feel alienated from this, even though I was like kind of afraid that I would be like, oh God, no, Leather Goddesses.
So it does, unlike most Infocom games, it gives you, kind of an excuse to replay the game as the other gender. But also, of course, with the 3 lewdness levels, you could theoretically replay the game 6 times as 2 genders times 3 lewdness levels. Although also with the lewdness levels, pretty much all the same stuff that I said about gender. Again, the differences between the lewdness levels are, 1%, 2% of the entire game. So you're not going to see a lot that you didn't see in the other lewdness levels.
So we are basically at almost the end of this panel discussion after like an hour and a half. Thank you everyone for sticking around. And I guess we have time for maybe like 2 more questions. One of them I'm gonna throw in from our document. Where is it? I think Simon was asking that he knows that the Activision owns like the IP of Leather Goddesses of Phobos. But I was just curious, like, Simon, do you want to ask the question? I feel weird kind of like doing questions for
okay.
people.
I was curious. Yeah, I mean, I was curious if there'd been any other interest in at least reproducing the Scratch and Sniff card as some sort of aftermarket product. But I assume that no one has done this until Jazz, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, even when Activision re-released the game, I think they released, if I recall correctly, it was a black and white non-scratchable reproduction of the card. So probably anyone playing that version got to that point in the game and was told scratch spot number 3, and they're there. I don't smell anything. But yeah, I mean, in general, Activision has been doing nothing with the Infocom stuff, and every now and then I get kind of a communication from someone saying, I'm interested in doing this with Planetfall, or I'm interested in doing this with A Mind Forever Voyaging, or what have you. Who should I talk to at Activision? And everyone who I know has long since left. And generally, if I've heard back from any of those people, it's that they tried getting through to anyone at Activision and never got their calls returned. So I think it's, just any kind of upside that Activision sees from exploiting the Infocom licenses just isn't enough to be worth their attention.
And I'm sorry, I forgot to ask this question earlier. So I know that you haven't smelled all the odors, but if you're willing, and if anyone else also has experienced the odors before, would you be down to smell like a random selection of 3? And like, especially leather, I'm kind of curious, like, if the formulation is either better or worse than it might have been before.
Well, like I said, leather was always the weakest of the 7. Yeah, it's still pretty weak. Smells a little perfumier than I recall, but I mean, keep in mind, any memory I have of these scents is from over 30 years ago.
Yeah, and for those who want to scratch along, number 6 is leather. Ash was having trouble actually identifying that in the game.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember other ones. So I'll reread the list from before, kind of remember from like off the top of my head. There's pizza is the first one. The second one's chocolate. Third one's mothball. Fourth one is like cologne/perfume, maybe a bit meant to be incensey, not really sure. Fifth one is bad breath, aka garlic, from Thorbala, who, that was an interesting interaction. Also, odors can travel through space in this game. Amazing.
Yes. It was so wild. I'm like, girl, why can I smell your breath?
In a vacuum, yeah. Like your breath is so bad that it can travel in a vacuum through different suits, like permeability. And then 6 is leather and 7 is banana. But that one, I don't know about the original formulation, but this one smells kind of like candy banana. I don't know. I might be like biasing people now by giving labels.
Yeah, banana was a really top identifier, which this definitely feels off.
Interesting. And Mike, if one day I ever get funding for preserving the original card, I might try and talk to you. Since you have like an unscratched original, we might be able to do like headspace sampling or something to actually try and recover the 3M formulas in some weird way. But yeah, so banana runts.
Yeah, the mothballs, I mean, it smells like mothballs plus candy.
Interesting. Yeah, and like the strength of the, part of like the questions with the design of the card were just like how close they are to each other so that you start sniffing by accident other odors. Yeah, I don't know like how much thought was put into like the design of the card itself and spacing and things like that.
Yeah, well, certainly the total size of the card was determined by the pouch where the feelies went. You know, they couldn't have been spread too much further apart unless you put the name Leather Goddesses between the two rows instead of on top of the two rows.
Yeah, the original Odorama card for polyester was doing that probably for that reason, where it kind of has like the numbers on the top and the bottom edge of the card and then a word in the middle.
And of course, with polyester, the scratches all occurred over the course of, say, 2 hours. You know, whereas here the scratches, you know, I wouldn't even say they occurred over 30 hours because you don't play the game all in one sitting, you know, so it was probably, they occurred more over the space of several weeks.
Yeah, and Jesse's pointing out something that I mentioned to Simon, which is that this formulation of candied banana is actually based on a smell/flavor of an extinct variation of bananas. So we might be actually experiencing the banana from 1930 that our main character may have experienced at the time also, or maybe on Venus. So unintentional historical archiving. And then Lori was asking, do you do custom design the font/number for the numbers? And Michael was saying, I can't remember if the font was custom designed, but our design folks like doing things like that. And definitely took me a while to reproduce the lettering because there's a lot of dots. So unless there's any final comments from people, we're actually 5 minutes over. I don't want to keep Steve and everyone else hostage in the Twitch and Sniff Along series discussion. So first of all, thank you to everyone for joining in. And yeah, opportunity to, if anyone wants to stick around and chat about things, feel free. I'll stay here and leave the room open. Again, a big thank you to Steve for joining us. And I guess like reviving memories from how many years? It's
35?
Yeah, 35. Oh, it's like the 35th year anniversary of Leather Goddesses of Phobos. So applause to that.
Yeah, well, that'll be this fall, so call it 34 and a half.
And then thank you to our panelists, Simon, Ash, Libby, and Ariana for joining at Media Archaeology Lab and the Weston Game Lab. So yeah, thank you.
And just, you know, thank you for such an interesting topic.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, you know, lots of people want to talk about the old Infocom days, but it's, you know, generally the same old questions, you know, kind of where did you get the idea for this, or what was it like to work with Douglas Adams, or, you know, how did you get your job at Infocom in the first place, etc. And, you know, this was just such a refreshingly different topic.
Thank you. Yes, and I'll answer people's questions as well. But yeah, it was funny like emailing you about this, and you're like, "Wow, this is such an unusual topic and a fast response." So I appreciated that a lot. I didn't know if you would even be able to respond or anything like that. I don't usually get responses from people, so that was really cool. And for people that are curious, this is recorded, so I'll check with Mike and a couple other people first before I post this online, just to check that everything's okay. And it will probably be on YouTube unless I cut some things. And then the streams are available on Twitch. We'll piece them together as like a horrendously long YouTube video for people that want to re-experience that. And I'll try to do like a supercut of every time we smell something in our responses so that people can check that one out as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Oh, yeah.
all. Thank you, Jazz.
Simon's pointing out for people that already left, but Leisure Suit Larry 7, Leisure Suit Larry Love for Sale, which was a 1996 game that Al Lowe made with Scratch and Sniff, is next month's installment. So do sign up for that. It has also reproduced Scratch and Sniff cards with all the original odors. Yeah. And
how many odors on that card?
There are, okay, so super weird card, first of all, but there are 9 odors. And they did the weirdest trick that I asked Al Lowe about, which is they did a checkerboard pattern of the screen printing so that they could extend the amount of surface area that they have while reducing the cost of you actually printing that surface area. Fascinating tricks. But yeah, 9 odors, really cool way of using them as well. Yeah. I can mail people them. They're all free, like the current series. So let me actually put a link to that in the chat again. Great. So there it is. And yeah, I'll stick around. People can hang out here if they want to, but no obligation. I'll end the recording at this point.